These are players that should absolutely be in your lineups this week in fantasy football leagues. And let's start with Ladd McConkey. Obviously, a decent showing last week for Ladd McConkey. He came out, he did have a touchdown. He had 7 targets, 5 receptions for only 39 yards. But again, he got that touchdown. It kind of salvaged his day. He had 12.5 points. With Ladd McConkey, I expect this to grow moving forward. Right, as a rookie, he's a dude that I think is going to get better as the season goes on. He's going to get more targets as the season goes on. He showed that he was going to be the leading target earner for the Chargers, even in week 1. And getting a touchdown in week 1, I feel even better about starting Ladd McConkey this week. Because while our start-sit tool has this matchup as a red matchup for the Chargers, it's because it's taking a lot of last year's data because we only have 1 week of sample size for matchups this year. But when we're looking at what last week the New Orleans Saints and Derek Carr of all quarterbacks were able to do to this Carolina Panthers defense, it was atrocious. And so with Ladd McConkey, you expect him to come in here, be the leading target earner again this week, and I expect the Chargers to actually have some success throwing the ball. And Justin Herbert's a good quarterback, right? And so when you're talking about Justin Herbert's wide receiver 1 in a matchup where you're talking about one of the worst defenses to start the year in the NFL. Period, exclamation point. And so with that being said, I think Ladd is a good start. And the Vegas line for this is at, I think, 39 points. And so with that being said,
that's so bad.
It's not going to be a high-scoring game. And we know that it's not going to be a high-scoring game. Totally acknowledge that. But, again, even though the lights don't look fantastic on this game, I do think it's worth noting that
most of those points are going to be the Chargers. Let's be honest.
And I think that's probably baked into here. And Carolina also just lost one of their best defenders. I think that's going to influence this game as well. It's a banged up, poor defense that Ladd McConkey's going against, and I could see him continuing his little breakout that he has at the beginning of his career here. So Ladd, I think, is a good start in week 1, and I think you should be plugging him in your flex spots this week.
Yeah, and I think we're going to go ahead and sit Amari Cooper week 2. I understand that he got 9 targets in week 1. I understand that he is still the wide receiver 1 in that situation, but at the end of the day, Deshaun Watson is awful. I don't think the situation in Cleveland is as good as people have made it out to be. I think they have a lot of things to figure out. Honestly, I much prefer Flacco to be throwing the ball to Amari Cooper than Deshaun Watson right now. And with Amari Cooper going against the Jacksonville Jaguars, they're not expected to have a very productive week overall between the two offenses. It's going to be a pretty low line, according to Vegas. At the end of the day, you're seeing in our wide receiver rankings, Amari Cooper in the same tier, a small tier, as Zay Flowers and Stephon Diggs. I honestly would rather start one of those guys this week just because I know what those situations look like. I trust in Lamar Jackson and I trust in CJ Stroud more than I trust in Deshaun Watson. And for me, that's good enough to sit Amari Cooper if I'm able to in week 2. I know a lot of people are going to have to start Amari Cooper given the investment, given how short they are at wide receiver right now with some of the injuries going on. But look, if you can do it, you need to be sitting Amari Cooper this week until they can figure that offense out. And then speaking of CJ Stroud and the Houston Texans offense, I'm going to have you start Tank Dell this week. We kind of alluded to this in this week's buy video with Tank Dell, but look, I think a lot of people are going to look at week 1, and this is exactly what we suspected. Everyone was going to look at that matchup and say, hey, Nico Collins and Stephon Diggs, they are the guys. They are the 1 and the 2, and Tank Dell is the odd man out. He's the third option. I cannot stress enough how bad of an idea it is to conclude what that wide receiver situation looks like after week 1 in a matchup that was a dream matchup for Diggs and Nico Collins. It was a dream matchup for Tank Dell too, and he got 7 targets, out-targeting Nico Collins really until the fourth quarter where Collins was able to get a decent amount of usage there towards the end of the game. But I think in this matchup this week against the Chicago Bears, who honestly still have a lot to figure out themselves, I'm looking at that situation and I'm like, man, I think CJ Stroud is going to have, I think he's going to put up another clinic. I think Mixon is going to look really good. I think Nico Collins and Stephon Diggs are going to show, some decent upside as well. But honestly, it took 2 touchdowns for Stephon Diggs to put up 20 points in week 1. And that's probably what I want to stress the most. I like Stephon Diggs. I have liked Stephon Diggs going into the year because I thought his price was a little too low. And I knew that he was going to be the exclusive, safe slot wide receiver. But with Tank Dell, he's the do-it-all guy. And in a situation in Chicago where I think they're probably going to be focusing more on Nico Collins and Stephon Diggs because they're smart, I think that's going to leave Tank Dell open around the field, all over the field. And I think he's going to get some more opportunities, some more upside to score some touchdowns touchdowns in week 2 in a game that's probably going to be one of the more productive games as well.
Let's go to Zamir White as somebody we are not starting this week. Obviously a tough matchup against the Baltimore Ravens, and Isaiah Pacheco was able to get his own against the Ravens mainly because he scored a touchdown. Without that, Isaiah Pacheco was facing a tough defense in the Baltimore Ravens, and so it's not a good matchup. The offense obviously has proved not to be good, but also you're considering not starting Zamir White just plainly because he didn't really get all the valuable touches in that offense in terms of receptions and in terms of red zone touches. And so you had Alexander Mattison coming out and actually out producing Zamir White in week 1, and I think that's significant. The Vegas line for this game also does no favors to the Raiders. 41.5 points is what the line is set at, and so you don't really like the outlook for a high-scoring game. You don't really like the matchup. You don't really like the offense. And then from a context standpoint as well, I don't think you're looking at this Raiders team after week 1 and saying, I'm encouraged by this. I like what I see. I think Zamir White, again, until he kind of proves that he can get back to that role where he is getting valuable touches, I'm not sure you can even, I'm not even sure you could start him. They also are traveling east for a 1 o'clock start, and they're playing in Baltimore. So, from a context standpoint as well, that also matters a lot. Let's go to Chris Godwin as somebody we should start this week. And Godwin obviously had a very productive week 1. He's somebody we had on our buys video, and now he's going to be on our must starts video. We are going to scream this from the rooftops. Chris Godwin was one of the best values in fantasy football this year, and he still is. And you can still buy Chris Godwin. Somebody's like, oh, you can't buy Chris Godwin. Yeah, you can buy Chris Godwin. You can buy Chris Godwin everywhere. And he's playing the Lions this week. Detroit Lions offense that just gave up, 25 points to Cooper Kupp because Cooper Kupp got 20 targets. And Chris Godwin, again, coming off an 18-point game where he did score a touchdown, but the matchup is good. The Lions give up a lot of points to fantasy wide receivers from last year into this year. The offense obviously has shown that they can support both Mike Evans, who we have high in our rankings this week, and Chris Godwin, who we also have we have him as a wide receiver 2 in our rankings this week. The Vegas line for this one's at 48.5. It projects to be another high-scoring game for both teams, and so because of that, I think Chris Godwin, the main thing for him is he's super high floor, right? He's going to get the number of targets needed to at least score like 9 or 10 points, and then if he scores a touchdown, it's bonus, because he had 8 targets, he caught all 8 of them because he's playing out of the slot, and Godwin out of the slot is a lock to be productive in fantasy football. 83 yards go along with that, and the stat line is beautiful. 8 targets, 8 receptions, 83 yards, 1 touchdown on 78% snaps. It's perfect. He led the team in receiving. Obviously, Mike Evans had the 2 touchdowns, but in terms of yardage and targets, it was Chris Godwin. And so with that being said, Chris Godwin with another favorable matchup and a high-scoring matchup, I'm definitely feeling pretty good about that one.
Yep, and then we are going to have you sit Calvin Ridley this week again. Look, week 1, we were a little reluctant to start Calvin Ridley because we thought that Will Levis, from a passing perspective, was going to start slow. We were right, and we knew that Tony Pollard was going to do well. We were right about that. But with Calvin Ridley this week, it doesn't look any better because they are going against the New York Jets. And you saw what the New York Jets were able to do against San Fran on Monday night. Yes, they allowed a lot of production, but a lot of that was on the ground. A lot of that was in the run game. A lot of that was utilizing Deebo Samuel. Ayuk was pretty much shut down. And I think you're looking at Calvin Ridley and DeAndre Hopkins in a line that's already pretty low with like 43. The Vegas has a line at 43, I think, 42, 43. And I'm not expecting, again, another high-scoring game. I'm looking at Tony Pollard's outlook in this game being a lot higher than Calvin Ridley's specifically. I think it really is as simple as that. When you've got a matchup as tough as Sauce Gardner lining up on Calvin Ridley, I'm giving Sauce Gardner the upper hand every single day of the week. And I don't trust Will Levis any more than I did previously. Again, Will Levis is going to be one of the lower-end passing-capable quarterbacks until he proves that he can provide enough consistent volume and accuracy for Calvin Ridley to be productive. We expected a slow start for Ridley in a new situation with Tennessee, and that, again, is going to continue in week 2. And then I am going to have you start Mark Andrews. I think a lot of people are considering sitting Mark Andrews, especially if you own Isaiah Likely. If you went and you handcuffed Mark Andrews with Isaiah Likely, you got Isaiah Likely off of waivers, or you had Isaiah Likely and you took him in the last round of your draft just to handcuff with Mark Andrews just in case. A lot of you are considering, hey, I should probably start Isaiah Likely over Andrews. I would consider starting Mark Andrews, not necessarily over Isaiah Likely, but what I am saying is I'm putting Mark Andrews in my starting lineup regardless, because I think his matchup this week is way better than it was in week 1 against one of the best defenses in the league in Kansas City. Now they have kind of a neutral, they have a yellow light neutral matchup against Vegas, and I think he's going to be fine. He was double teamed pretty much all day, Thursday night opening day against the Kansas City Chiefs, and that's not going to happen again. I mean, you're looking at the line for the Ravens and the Raiders being 41.5. Again, that's going to be on the lower end, but I think that Zay Flowers is going to be focused on by Vegas' secondary more than Mark Andrews. I think Isaiah Likely has now shown on tape that he is kind of an X factor guy for Lamar Jackson and has some big playability. Mark Andrews is going to be more of like that possession wide receiver, and I think you're going to look at Baltimore really trying to slow the game down a bit more instead of passing it and going crazy with Lamar as much as they did in week one. Because what they did in week one against Kansas City just is not going to be sustainable for them to win games. I think you're going to see them go back to basics, run the ball first with Derrick Henry, and then get the ball to Mark Andrews. I mean, that really is their bread and butter. That's how they've been so successful for the last 4 years, really. So expect a bounce back from Mark Andrews. I am totally comfortable starting him this week.
Let's go to somebody we are not starting, and that's going to be Christian Kirk. And when you look at what Christian Kirk did in week one, he was pretty much a no-show. And this was against Miami, which I thought was a fairly favorable matchup. I don't know how much Jalen Ramsey was on him versus Jalen Ramsey being on Brian Thomas. But with that being said, 4 targets, 1 reception for 30 yards. That's it. He had 1 catch. Outside of that, He did nothing. And everybody was talking about before the season, like, hey, look, Christian Kirk's not in 2 wide receiver sets. It's Thomas and Davis. You saw that play out in week one, right? And so Christian Kirk was on the field getting less opportunity than those guys, still running a similar amount of routes, to be fair. But with that being said, going into week 2, he's playing the Cleveland Browns. This is a bad matchup for Christian Kirk. The Cleveland Browns just held CeeDee Lamb to 12 points. Brandon Cooks, I think he had 11 points, right? Something like that. But obviously both those guys, were able to get into double figures, right? 12 points for Brandon Cooks. They were able to get in double figures, but they didn't really allow any of those Cowboys weapons in a game where the Cowboys scored a ton of points. In a game where they scored a ton of points, still none of those weapons really popped off. And so with Christian Kirk, I mean, with the slow start, with the fact that he's playing a good defense, with the fact that from a Vegas standpoint, this game does not project to be a super high scoring game. The line is set at 41.5 right now. And so I don't expect a lot of touchdowns and scoring to come out of this game. I'm not feeling pretty good. I'm not feeling good at all about starting Christian Kirk in week one. So I would rather flex the guys around him over him for sure. I definitely think that Christian Kirk has some hope as the season goes on. He does continue to have chemistry with Trevor Lawrence, but again, I think what you saw in week one was concerning, and the week 2 matchup doesn't get much better. And so I'm going to go ahead and sit Christian Kirk in week 1. And then somebody that I'm going to start, and I'll actually give 2 people here. I would suspect they're going to put Ramsey on Keon Coleman, because originally Keon Coleman was like my guy here. Because when you're looking at the matchup for the Bills, they're playing the Dolphins. You just had the Jags play the Dolphins, and it was Brian Thomas that had a touchdown in that game. And outside of that, obviously Christian Kirk was shut down. It still projects to be a fairly good matchup for a couple reasons. Number one, I think the Dolphins, are kind of middle of the road in terms of giving up points to wide receivers, but also when you're looking at the Vegas over-under for this week, it's 50 points. It projects to be, Dolphins-Bills is always pretty much a shootout. That's why, Achane projects to be a really high-end running back this week. And so one of the Bills receivers, my projection is one of the Bills receivers is going to be the guy. I now, I'm thinking about it, I lean Khalil Shakir, honestly, because I do think that he probably has, again, the more favorable matchup from a cornerback standpoint. And Shakir, because Keon Coleman, while he didn't score a lot of fantasy points in week 1, was actually, from an opportunity standpoint, had a pretty good outlook. He had 5 targets, 4 receptions. He had 51 yards. So he did have 7 points. But Shakir actually had less targets than Keon Coleman, but scored more points because he had a touchdown, right? And so I'm just trying to decide between these 2 guys. I think it's going to be Shakir. I think you consider flexing both of these guys, though. I think they're both guys that, in a high-scoring matchup, Josh Allen, they're going to be slinging the ball. They're going to be in a shootout with Tua and Tyreek and Jalen Waddle. I think you start pieces of this offense, and I think the 2 wide receivers there that I want to start are Keon Coleman and Khalil Shakir for sure. Dalton Kincaid even didn't really do anything last week, and also, you had Dawson Knox in there, getting some targets. And so in a high-scoring game, you have to think who's going to score the touchdowns. I think both of those guys are flexible. Pick whichever one you want. I lean Khalil Shakir over Keon Coleman, but it's kind of up to you who you want to go with there.
Yeah, and Cortland Sutton is going to be our last sit here. He's got 2 red lights, one of which is the Vegas light, which we really like to focus on quite a bit. I mean, the over-under for that game is like 36.5. They're playing Pittsburgh. Again, we just saw the Pittsburgh game in week 1 against Atlanta. They were able to take a pretty, you expected, explosive offense with Kirk Cousins and held them to like 10 points. So I'm looking at this game with Denver to be pretty low. Yeah, Cortland Sutton got 12 targets last week. He didn't turn it into a ton of production. And then when you're looking at the context light as well, I mean, Bo Nix struggled last week. Yeah, he had a ton of passing volume, but the last thing you want for a rookie quarterback to be facing is TJ Watt in his second week in the NFL. I have zero trust in Bo Nix in his second week. I have zero trust in that offense. I think it's going to be ugly. I think it's going to be another rock fight. Got to get used to that with Steelers matchups this year because the Pittsburgh looks tough as nails again defensively. I think it's just as simple as, yeah, Cortland Sutton getting the volume. I don't think it's going to turn into anything. I think it's going to be ugly. He'll have no more than like 7 or 8 points most likely. So not excited about that matchup at all.
And so there you go. Last week on our Start to Sit video, we did pretty good. We had J-Mo as a start. We had Najee as a sit. We had Christian Watson as a start, and Christian Watson did okay. The one we missed
Pollard as a start.
We had Pollard as a start. We missed on Mostert, though. And so we're still dialing in the tool, especially as the tool, as we get more data as the NFL season goes on. I feel like it's going to get even better.
Yeah.
But you can get the tool at flockfantasy.com/domain when you use code domain and sign up for any subscription. If you sign up for the annual Mother Flocker tier with code domain, you also get a team blueprint, which looks like this for your fantasy football team. It's us breaking down your fantasy football team personally and grading it step by step to make sure that you are in position to win your fantasy football leagues. So like I said, flockfantasy.com/domain. Make sure you use code domain. But appreciate you guys watching. Make sure you subscribe if you play fantasy. We'll see you later.